As Lee just mentioned, though, clearly coronavirus and the fears around that is impacting how voters are thinking about the 2020 field and handling their rallies and campaigns as well. And Kristin, I know you've been looking into that as Trump continues to have rallies across the country.
Yeah, not just Trump, but also Biden and Sanders. So I know that we have several states that are voting today, Michigan, of course, being one of the big swing states and battleground states that's going to be going to the polls today. But just next week, we have Ohio coming up, we have Illinois, we have Arizona. And so what we're seeing is that these candidates are not at all slowing down their campaigning. They're continuing to hold rallies. They are continuing to shake hands and kiss babies, so to speak. So I reached out to the campaigns to ask them, are you guys at all concerned? Are you taking any sort of precautions? Now, the Sanders camp did respond, and they said that they're only holding rallies in consultation with public health officials in any of the cities or areas that they're going to be, doing these events. The the Biden and Trump campaigns, however, just did not respond. But I think that this is probably largely due to the fact that these campaigns aren't entirely sure how they are meaning to respond and aren't entirely sure yet how they want to manage or mitigate the risk of coronavirus. I mean, in the last couple of days, we've heard how President Trump has already met with several congressmen and women that have actually been in touch with people or in contact with people that were tested positive for coronavirus. We have heard Women for Trump, they had a bus tour going. They've decided to completely postpone that to later in the year. Of course, this is, again, around fears. But no, the campaign's largely seeming to be going full steam ahead. I guess none of them want to let this virus in any way, shape, or form slow them down or scuttle their chances at clinching that nomination or victory in the general election.
And outside of campaigning, I'd be curious to get your guys' take on how it's impacting what we might actually see play out at the polls or who voters right now are favoring too, because a CNN poll that just came out yesterday was asking voters about which candidate could handle the economy best, especially considering all the market jitter fears that we just saw come out around coronavirus. Interesting to see Joe Biden leading in that category by a margin of 57%. Only 31% of voters think that Sanders might be able to handle the economy better. I
think that's to be expected, though, because a lot of people are afraid that Bernie Sanders in general is bad for the economy. So I think that they would approve of a far more centrist candidate like Joe Biden to be, quote unquote, a little bit more presidential than some of them believe that the president is currently being during this crisis. Again, we've had just complete misinformation. He said the other day he didn't know that the flu killed people, or that people died rather from the flu, which is alarming, I think. So I think that people look at Joe Biden as someone very presidential, able to steer the country through this. I will say, however, yesterday Bernie Sanders was actually speaking on a panel about coronavirus, and he made some, I think, pretty salient points around the fact that if everyone had health care, then people can go and get treatment if they do become ill from something like coronavirus. And a lot of the worker protections that he has been fighting for would be great for a low-wage worker in this exact crisis. We might see that even temporarily put in place here, too. But even for those with health care, it's not entirely clear what could be done in terms of going to the doctor right now, because we've heard a lot of stories about everything just being in shambles in terms of actually getting this handled or not having enough tests. But I do wonder what might happen tonight, too, though, when we think about who might be voting and how a more moderate candidate like Joe Biden could be impacted, maybe more or less than a Bernie Sanders when we think about people going to the polls. If you are an older voter, I would imagine you would want to stay away from crowds anyways, whereas if you're a younger millennial, we know Bernie's very popular with younger voters. I wonder if that might impact things, too, if you're thinking about people going to the polls. I've actually asked several.
I would imagine millennials wouldn't be afraid.
I have asked the DNC this very question. I've also asked several heads, like the Democratic parties in several states, and they said that they don't imagine that voters will be staying away from the polls because of coronavirus. Now, the CDC actually did come out and say, listen, you should avoid large groups, like a rally. You should avoid, shaking hands, instead doing non-contact, greeting gestures, I guess, like the elbow bump that I've seen some people doing. But I don't think it's going to stop voters from trying to get in, cast their ballot, and then get out.
Yeah.
And I've been doing some speaking at universities, and I could tell you on a university front, they are bringing people studying abroad back, but they're still doing group activities. And I think in general, millennials are used to bunking up, being in small spaces with their peers. So I think, to your point, it's going to actually bring them to the polls, and that could positively impact Bernie's outcome.
Yeah, we'll see how that gap. I mean, there's always a gap between younger voters and older voters in terms of turnout, but I'd be interested to see if that shrinks tonight. We'll keep our eyes on it, bringing the news as it develops, as always, right here on Y5 PM.